What is the meaning of life? My word, there is a huge question. And in fact, that question is so huge that many thinkers over the years have said that actually we need to break it down into simpler questions to really try and figure out an answer to it. And there's a very influential American psychologist called Roy Baumeister. A few years ago, wrote a best-selling book called Meanings of Life, in which Roy says to answer the question, what is the meaning of life, we need to answer four other questions: the question of meaning, the question of value, the question of identity, and the question of agency. Who am I? What am I worth? What am I here for? And can I make a difference? In the previous video, in the first video in this series, we tackled the first of Roy's little sub-questions. We thought about identity and showed the huge difference between Christianity and atheism on the question of what it means to be a human being. In this short answer, I want to take the second question that Roy introduces, the question of value. What are we worth? What am I worth? What are you worth as a human being? And the answer to that question is utterly, utterly crucial. Because if, for example, we're going to talk about things like human rights and justice, these things we are so concerned about in the modern world, unless we can answer the question of does a human being have value, we can't talk about justice, because justice only makes sense if the person that's been hurt or offended or wronged actually has some kind of value, some kind of dignity to them. So how do we answer the value question? Well, if we were to approach that purely as atheists, if we were to imagine for a moment that we lived in an atheist universe, a godless universe, here atheism has a real problem. Because how do you as an atheist talk meaningfully about human value? Really, you can't get beyond talking about the stuff of which human beings are made. Really, we are just the value of the stuff that makes us up. And every human being comprises, so much carbon, so much potash, so much sodium, so much iron, so much water, and so on and so forth. And actually, it's actually been calculated that the average human being, if you take the chemical components of which we are made, we are worth really no more than about £6, $10 in terms of our chemical parts that make us up. Well, clearly that's wrong. Clearly that cannot be right, that human beings are just comprised, their value comprises the stuff they're made of. Well, where do you go from there? Maybe as an atheist you might start talking about, well, maybe we look at what somebody can do. We look at the skills, the abilities that human beings have, and that's where their value is found. If we want to say that our value is found in the things that we can do, the skills that we possess, what about people who don't possess those skills? What if we want to say that, well, being human, our value comes from our ability to use our mind and consciousness? Well, what do you do with someone who's perhaps profoundly disabled, who has some kind of learning disability, who can't exercise those skills as much as somebody else? And in fact, the very famous atheist writer in the USA, Sam Harris, on one occasion said, the problem is if you go that route, whatever skill, whatever ability you use to differentiate between human beings and animals, say, can equally be used to differentiate between human beings themselves. And atheism really gets shipwrecked, I think, on the rock, on the reef of the value question. It has no meaningful way to answer that question. Well, then we turn over to the Christian faith and so ask the question, what does the Bible say? What does Christianity say about human value? And in the last video, the first video in this series, we looked at Genesis chapter 1 and that amazing statement that human beings were created in the image of God. That's a great starting point for value. But then the Bible adds something else. One of my favorite verses in the New Testament, in Romans 5 verse 8, we are told that God demonstrates his love for us in that while we were still his enemies, Christ died for us. And if you want to know what the God of the Bible thinks about your value, you can look at that verse and say, I am so valued, I am so loved, that God was willing to pay the highest possible price, the price of the life of Jesus for me. That's an incredible value that the Bible places upon human life, and that gives us an incredible building block that we can then use to answer that bigger question of life's true meaning. Well, there we are. We've thought about the question of value, what a human life is worth, and shown the profound differences when you compare the Christian answer to that question with the atheist answer to that question. And that's just one of those four questions, the question of identity and value, purpose and agency, that we've said you need to address if you're going to answer the much bigger question of life's meaning. If you haven't seen it already, check out the first video in this short answer series where we thought about the identity question, and look out for the next two where we're going to think a bit together about purpose and about agency. And as we do that, we're going to show, I believe, how if you want to answer the question of the meaning of life, Christianity is really infinitely more helpful in its answers than those found in atheism.